Hello, everyone. My name's Arwen Summers, and I'm a publisher at Hardie Books. And I'm here today with the wonderful Clem Bastow, author of Late Bloomer: How an Autism Diagnosis Changed My Life. If you haven't read this book, I'm going to do a Molly Meldrum and say, do yourself a favor, get out there and buy it straight away. But Clem, for the benefit of those who haven't yet got a copy, could you give us a quick summary of what your book is about?
Sure, I can give you the elevator pitch. I kind of like to call it a time traveling memoir. So it sort of starts at this moment of diagnosis and looks backwards and forwards. So I was diagnosed when I was 36, and in doing so, kind of started to re examine my life and understand certain things that had happened to me through this prism of understanding, understand it through the prism of understanding of diagnosis. So yeah, it's a memoir, but it's also, I guess, more broadly using my experiences to kind of contextualize certain aspects of autistic experience that I guess are still quite opaque to some people. So you know, they might have been diagnosed, or maybe their kid's been diagnosed, and you're given all of these clinical terms, and you just kind of go, yeah, but what are they? So it's a way of looking at some of those terms through that kind of lens of my own experience.
Yeah, right. Kind of humanizing the clinical terms and normalizing the autistic experience as, a human experience instead of being something that happens in institutions, which I think is unfortunately one of the kind of notions of how autistic people must end up, thanks to Rain Man. No, we've,
My favorite film.
yeah. Well, I think, as you've said to me, Rain Man was important because it was representation. Like any representation is better than no representation at all. But how much were the kind of stereotypes about autism in your mind when you set out to write Late Bloomer?
Look, they were very much cemented, and I think I'm a person who, I've worked as a cultural critic. I'm a screenwriter. I understand how screen media works, and even I had absorbed these imperfect representations, whether they were explicit, like Rain Man, or atypical, or kind of coded as autistic, like Sheldon from Big Bang Theory. And so you get to the point where you just think, all right, well, that's what autism looks like. And what it looks like is, a white, straight, awkward man who's interested in stats and STEM fields. And I was none of those things. I mean, I am white, but that was it. So I didn't really ever think that that was possibly what was going on in my life, because the kind of the weight of those depictions is so huge. So it was only when I was actually writing a character myself who turned out to be autistic that I started to think, oh, I should read some more about this. I want to not do a Rain Man. So I started to do my research, and as I was doing that, was experiencing this quite strange thing of going, okay, yep, like, oh, that's me, and yep, that happened to me in primary school, and so as I was writing this character for this screenplay, kind of at the same time writing my way to a diagnosis. So I guess yeah, that was part of it too. Was wanting to illustrate that it can look quite different to what we understand through the media. And I think it's great timing that it's out now, because I think there is this growing understanding of the diversity of experiences within autism. But what I also wanted to write about too was the sort of universal things that I think most if not all autistic people experience, just to differing degrees. So this idea of a spectrum is something that's new to quite a lot of people, and they sort of often think that it starts at not autistic and ends at very autistic, and it's actually a lot more nuanced than that. So part of what I set out to do with the book was to kind of illustrate that too, that there are experiences that are unique to autism, and that all autistic people experience them to differing degrees, and sometimes differing degrees from day to day. That our so-called functioning is not static.
Yeah, which is
So
true
in, in
of everyone, right? But people seem to forget it. You have good days and bad days.
yeah,
Um, I think you've used two beautiful analogies that have really helped me to get my head around the idea of a spectrum. One of them was, you said it's like an RGB spectrum, when you're using Paint Shop Pro or whatever, uh, and it was a kind of circle with colors in it.
yeah,
So instead of it being a linear kind of, a linear progression that has uncanny echoes of, say, evolution. It's more
Mm.
like a color spectrum. And the other analogy that you use in the book that I have repeated constantly is Pokemon related. Clem and I have shared a love of Pokemon throughout the editing process of the book. And you say, it's not enough to catch a few Pokemon, you got to catch them all. And there
Got
might
to catch
be
them all.
different stages of evolution as well.
That's right. Yeah, to get in the club, yeah, you have to catch them all. I think that's the thing that people don't understand. And when people say things like, "Well, aren't we all a little bit autistic, or aren't we all on the spectrum?" No, we're not. And in order to be on the spectrum, there are a sort of minimum number of experiences and that you have to have as an autistic person. But where I do think that those sorts of phrases are helpful is that they can, I think they can be used in the sort of pursuit of empathy. So, in reading the book, maybe somebody who used to think, "Oh, we're all a bit autistic," can kind of recognize, okay, I've experienced something of sensory overload, so now I have an empathy for what it must be like to be prone to that all the time, rather than thinking
Yeah.
about it as these things that you sort of experience discreetly, like I once went to a loud concert, or one day my heater was too hot. Like it's sort of a process of going, okay, I remember the day when my heater was too hot, and imagine feeling like that all the time.
Yeah,
Or the time I couldn't express myself. Like what if that was every day of your life? So yeah, I hope that the sort of Pokemon analogy is like the kind of springboard to understanding something of the nuance of the spectrum itself.
absolutely. I feel like I went on a journey of learning and wonderment in the process of working with you on this book. As someone who had limited understanding of neurodiversity but was interested in it, it's been so fascinating to kind of understand that classic phrase, which is overused but so true, which is if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. There are overlapping experiences, but everyone is an individual and has a totally different response to the world. There are other themes in the book which I found really interesting to read and to talk to you about when we were editing it together. Gender is a big one. Hey, Millie. Class is another big one, and mental health features in there too. How much were you conscious of, or how much did you want to incorporate these other themes into your memoir, knowing that it was the foundation of the memoir was always going to be your diagnosis as an autistic person?
Oh, hugely. I think because a lot of the I call them in the book the sliding doors moments, where I sort of go, oh, what if at this moment in grade 2 somebody had done something. We were limited by the fact that my school was very underfunded. We were pretty poor ourselves, so even if I had been picked up, it's possible that that sliding doors moment could have actually led to worse outcomes. So I think that was really important. I think there is often this kind of misunderstanding that late diagnosis is something that super privileged people kind of have the time to, oh, that's interesting, that it's a bit like going on ancestry.com or something, and it's not at all. So yeah, class was a big thing for me, also just because that was a fact of my youth. So beyond, even though I was an autistic young person, even though I didn't know it, so much of my experience of school was also coloured through that lens of class, of not having the right clothes or t-shirt, or not being able to afford to go to this, that and the other. So that was always a really big part of it for me. And the gender thing was really important as well, because you know like a lot of autistic people, my kind of perception of my own gender is constantly in flux. But I was also aware of the fact that a lot of people don't recognise that autism can present differently in girls and women and gender diverse people. Um, so that was a big part of it as well, was to sort of say, for many years we didn't think that a lot of clinicians didn't think that girls could be autistic, full stop, because so much of the clinical literature was drawn from studies which were inevitably done on young boys. And in the writing process, I spoke to some psychologists who were working in the 80s, because I wanted to kind of get a sense of if somebody had picked up that I had these differences, what would have been the outcome. And a lot of them said it just would not have even been on the radar. That in the early 80s, if a girl didn't also have an intellectual disability or some other disability, it would have been so unlikely for them to have even considered autism. Like it was just not on the table. So it's possible that I would have been misdiagnosed.
Right.
And I'd certainly had a number of them throughout my life. So the gender thing was really important, and I think I was careful to not be too prescriptive about it, because you don't want it to become another binary where it's like, well, you're either Sheldon Cooper or you're, this outgoing, vivacious young girl who copies these characters of fiction or copies the popular girls, and that's how she copes. Because I think I had a bit of all of them. But to just make it clear that it can look like that in young girls, I think is really important, because I certainly know lots of women who are Sheldon Cooper, who are Rain Man, who don't fit that sort of feminized model. But the knowledge that it can look like that, I think, is quite revolutionary for some people.
Yeah.
So
Well, there's
yeah, I think the gender and the class stuff was a really important thing for me.
Yeah, I was reminded of the lost generation that you talk about too, about how there are people, both men and women now in their 30s, 40s, or 50s, who are being diagnosed who, if they were a child now, would probably be diagnosed at age 3, 4, 5. And so it
Yeah.
kind of reflects that very rigid idea of what an autistic person can be or look like from the past. It's a great time to be autistic.
It is. It is. And I guess there's this, you often hear this quite unkind approach, which is, oh, there's an epidemic of autism. And it's not the case at all. I don't, as far as I'm aware, I don't think they believe that the actual kind of literal, you know, what's the word that I'm looking for, prevalence of autism to have changed at all. It's just that we're getting better at finding it. So yeah, for younger people, there are improved kind of diagnostic approaches. But yeah, also for that lost generation of people who may have either been completely misdiagnosed, or they may have been sort of misdiagnosed in the sense that something was picked up but not the whole story, which was the case for me. I was diagnosed as having anxiety and also depression, but not autism. And there were some other, question marks along the way. So this so-called kind of tidal wave of autistic people is actually just because that rigid idea of how it looks and how it manifests is starting to expand.
Yeah. It is, I mean, your book, I find it's just an extraordinary read, Clem. It was such a joy to work with you on it, but also to see how you've interwoven those broader societal themes, class, gender, relationships, mental health, with the foundation of autism, and using these clinical terms in a way that becomes really comprehensible, often quite funny. You are very witty and very charming, occasionally very heartbreaking too, but it is an absolutely, I'm going to use the word tour de force here. I don't think I've ever had the opportunity to use it before. Um, Thank you so much for talking to me about Late Bloomer today, which is out in bookshops now.
Thank you so much for publishing it.